Thank you all for joining us for our SICSS-Howard Mathematica Lunchtime Talk with Lisa García-Bedolla, Vice Provost for Graduate Studies and Dean of the Graduate Division from UC Berkeley. During these chats while you chew, you'll meet interesting people or organizations that are doing cool and complementary work to what you're currently learning about in the Summer Institute at Howard. If you don't have your lunch yet, hit pause. For those of you with food and beverage in hand, let's get started.
Thank you so much, Nanette, and thanks to all of you for being here today. As Nanette said, I am the Vice Provost for Graduate Studies and Dean of the Graduate Division at Berkeley. What that means is that it's my job to take care of the roughly 13,500 graduate students on campus to the best of my ability. When I came into this role, one of my top priorities was really focusing in on student well-being and also thinking about climate and belonging, particularly for our minoritized students and first-generation students. My training is in political science, and what is important to know is I've spent the last 20 years in my research life working with community-based organizations in California and around the country, using the tools of social science to try to help them evaluate and improve their practice. These organizations are working to mobilize and engage voters of color, particularly in low-income communities. So really thinking deeply about how the tools that you are learning in your Summer Institute can be used to improve and have impact on the ground. And so I took that experience with me when I came into this role. And the things I think it's really important to think about are not just how to analyze data, but then what to do with it. And I think often when we teach social science methods, first of all, they tend to be decoupled from reality. So you get these nice, pretty data sets that work really well in the classroom, but look not very much like what data looks like in the real world. Often it's very messy and very dirty. I think there's also been a movement, particularly with the emphasis on causal inference, to forget the importance of just basic data, descriptive data, and the power of interpretation in what we use data for and what kind of impact it has in the world. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about what we do here on campus at Berkeley and how I think it may be helpful or inform what you're learning and as you think about what you want to do with the skills that you're gaining now. So as I said, when I came in, it was very important to me to really think about how students were doing in their programs. We have 125 graduate programs at Berkeley at the master's, doctoral, and then professional levels such as law. And obviously, their experiences are very different depending upon where they come from, what they bring to campus, what their program is like, what their cohort is like. So even the experience within a department can be very different for two different students. And it's important to be able to both have the global view and then also be able to look at a very granular level at the students who we would talk about as outliers, right? We tend to focus in statistical analysis on the middle of the distribution, but for somebody like me, it's actually really important to think about what you do with the tails, right? Because often the tails can tell you more than the ones in the middle. So when I came in, I tried to take stock of what we knew and what we had on campus. I think what is true of most institutions of higher education is that we have a lot of data that we do very little with, or that is presented in ways that aren't really actionable on the ground. So again, I think this is why my experience with these organizations really mattered, because I'm used to really thinking about how do we put information and knowledge into practice. And I think that's something that I hope that you'll be thinking about as you move forward with your work this summer. So we tended to use one-time, one-shot big surveys to find out how things were going with students. Often these surveys have over 100 questions, which, as you can imagine, particularly in the world of Qualtrics, means that they are very long to take. And therefore, I seriously question who are the type of people who finish those surveys and how are they different maybe from the students who aren't answering. In particular, I think if you are in distress, or if you're feeling disengaged, or if you're feeling unhappy in your program, I think sometimes that's going to make you less likely to answer. Or there's a possibility that the people who answer could be bimodal in the same ways that Yelp reviews are, that you only get the really, really happy or the really, really angry and not a lot of information about the folks in the middle. And so what I learned in my research is that often to get closer to the answer, personally, I don't think social scientists have the ability to know what the truth is. I think we can approximate it and get close to it. The way to do it is to triangulate a lot of different types of information. And so I tried to take those learnings with me as I engaged in this administrative role. So there is some usefulness to the big one-time climate survey. You have information across different years. You've got sets of questions that you ask over time. You can look at trends, and you can also ask about a lot of different things in one shot. And so we are still using that survey here. But I also wanted to think about what other types of data collection we could engage in order to be able to really respond to students' needs in real time. And that need only grew during COVID because we knew that our students were experiencing things that they never had before. We were in a global pandemic, a one-time historic event. How do we pivot and make sure to be nimble as we think about what students need? So what we came up with on campus is what we called pulse surveys, which were surveys we gave roughly 3 times a semester that were super short and focused on particular actionable things like student mental health. So asking people whether they in the last month had experienced feelings of anxiety or depression. And the nice thing was then you were able to take that snapshot and see how it was moving over time. And then other questions about people's feelings about masking, people's feelings about safety in the classroom, other kinds of feelings depending on where we were in the pandemic, where we were in the lockdown period, and the kinds of things that were important to both instruction and student experience. I thought these surveys were really useful, first of all, because it let you see how things changed over the course of the semester. One of my critiques of the traditional climate survey is that it's one shot, one point in time, right? Cross-sectional surveys we're very good at doing in social science, but they really are measuring a moment. And while that moment may be useful if you measure multiple moments across multiple years, it doesn't tell you how student well-being ebbs and flows through the academic calendar. And I think that's something we need a better handle on in the university in order to ensure that we're providing resources and providing support and flexibility at the times when students need them most. So the nice thing about the Pulse survey was that it followed the academic calendar, and we clearly saw what we suspected, which was that student mental health is actually much better at the beginning of the semester than at the end. And so thinking about how do we ensure that our programs take that reality into consideration and perhaps provide different kinds of support. We have a sort of fun one here on campus. We call it Llama-Palooza. The university happens to have some llamas, and so we bring the llamas and we let people pet the llamas as a way to sort of find some joy at the end of the semester. I know that's a very Berkeley way to do it, but the important thing is now we know that we really need to do that at the end of the semester when people are the most stressed. Other kinds of data that we have that we don't, I think, take enough advantage of, we have exit surveys from all of our doctoral students. We also don't do a whole lot with web scraping of LinkedIn and other kinds of data from sites where people talk about what they're doing with their lives. And in particular, as we know that doctoral study in particular doesn't necessarily lead to an academic career. It doesn't have to, it can, but it doesn't have to. It would be better to know what kinds of other things. We've tended to just say, okay, people went into a tenure track job or they went into industry as a big category. But if we know more about the kinds of industries and the kinds of jobs our students are taking within different kinds of programs across campus, we can better serve them through professional development workshops and things of that sort. And we can also let them know, hey, did you know folks in your program did these kinds of things? Because I think we don't tend to do that very much, at least in graduate study. Similarly, on the master's side, we're just implementing for the first time on campus an exit survey for our master's students. Berkeley has shifted in the way that many institutions of higher education have shifted, in that we now have more master's and professional students on campus than we have doctoral students. But that's the least built out part of our student support structure on campus. I think there's always been the expectation that the service to those students happens in the programs. And while that's true, I think it's important for the university to be providing the right kinds of resources and supports to those students. And in order to do that, we need to know about what their experiences are like while they're on campus and in their programs, and then also what are the types of professions and jobs they tend to get when they come out, again, so that we can provide them with the kind of training, support, certificates, other kinds of things that will help them have a leg up and be sure that the degree launches them professionally in the ways that they want it to. And so I think the take home is really to say, if you look around any space that you're in, there are a lot of different kinds of data. We have survey data, we have climate data from particular departments, we have qualitative data that people gather through focus groups and conversations in their cohorts. We have web data on alumni experience and alumni trajectories. We have lots of different kinds of things that if we triangulate all those different pieces of information, we can have a better sense of what students are going through when they're on campus, and then also what happens to them once they leave. The other thing I want to make sure to spend a few minutes talking about, though, once you figure out all the different kinds of data you might have, is really thinking deeply about interpretation. And this is something that I've written about within social sciences, but I think it applies to institutions of higher education at least as well, in the sense that we don't talk enough about what we think our variables mean in the sense of how we're interpreting them. And so I would argue that by and large, when we think about race on campus, we treat race as a biological variable. When you dummy out race and you just say, okay, this is what Black students are experiencing, or this is what Latina students are experiencing, or this is what AAPI students are experiencing, we're assuming that there is a uniform homogeneous experience within those communities. And so first of all, if there isn't a statistically significant difference between those students and white students, we assume there isn't a problem. So the problem with that interpretation is that our baseline, our norm is whiteness, and we never question that norm, first of all. And then we basically say if there aren't group level differences, there isn't discrimination or there isn't a problem. And what that presumes is that, again, there's a homogeneous experience among, let's say Latina students, and that therefore they're going to be one standard deviation away from white folks on, climate or whatever issue, rather than digging into the information within that community and looking at, well, what are the factors that seem to be driving time to degree or seem to be driving people's attitudes towards climate? In my own work, what I've done is that I actually run models of each group separately rather than dummying out race, within a model where everyone is together, because you get away from that, first of all, the idea that people of color are sort of a pathologized deviation from the norm. But in addition to that, it means you can look more closely then at what are the mechanisms that are happening within communities. And again, we tend to undervalue descriptive data, right? As the tools of social science have gotten more elaborate and more technical, we've forgotten that actually just looking at frequencies can be quite informative in terms of understanding overall, oh, okay, so we have this group of students over here that look this way, we have this group of students over here, that if you were to just aggregate everybody together, you would miss that nuance. And so that's what I was talking about in terms of thinking about the tails, because on some level, it's important to think about, okay, so if 85% of students say the climate is great, is that success? Or does it have to be 90? Does it have to be 95? Are we happy with 5% being unhappy? And so we don't often talk about what success looks like in these contexts. And I think that's something to think about as you interpret the data that you're looking at this summer. What's a good result? What's an appropriate result? Because I would argue that even if only 5% of students say that they're having a bad experience, that's not success for the university, and that we have to look very closely at what is driving those students' experiences, because it is in fact the students that are the most vulnerable or having the most difficult circumstances that really can let us know how we're doing more broadly. And so I would ask you to think about under what circumstances looking at the center of the distribution makes sense, and under what circumstances looking at the tails is actually a better way to interpret your results. I would ask you to think carefully about how you're conceptualizing your variables. The assumptions of independence that are true in regression analysis assume that these variables bounce off each other and are independent of one another, when we know, in fact, that's not true. Personally, I don't think interaction terms really get us out of this bind, but I think really the most important thing is for researchers to be very thoughtful about the assumptions that they're making, first of all, from a conceptual standpoint, and then thinking about how they operationalize those assumptions and how the math works in terms of the models that you're building, in order to make sure that your interpretation on the other end is actually accurate or reflects what the data can tell you. I'll just end by saying that I think one of the biggest, I actually think Zubairi's work on this is really good if you want somebody to read, but I think we tend to overinterpret from data. And so being very careful about what in fact you know and what you don't know, and how to provide the caveats necessary to make sure that you're not overstating what you found, you're not understating what you found, you're not assuming a relationship that you actually can't justify. But most importantly, that you remember that each of those data points represents a human being that has a particular set of life experiences, that brings a particular set of strengths as well as weaknesses, and who you are reflecting in your work, or whose words, whose needs, whose values you are trying to represent with the work you're doing. And when we're doing that work for, be they students or people in a community or patients or whatever, who are vulnerable, it's really, really important to us. It is really, really, really important that we get it right, that we not overinterpret, and that we get as close as possible to those people's truth. And that's not always easy, and our methods aren't perfect. And many of our methods were created to support eugenics and other structures that we now know aren't true. So I think really thinking about, why is it you're using the tool you're using? How good is the data that you're inputting into that tool? What are the possible idiosyncrasies about that data that you need to be aware of? How representative is it of the communities that you're trying to study? And how are you going to interpret what comes out of it? And be very mindful of how that interpretation could be politicized or used to actually undermine the work that you're doing in that vulnerable community. So all that is to say, there's a lot of data out there for us to use, but I think it's really important for us to remember why we're using it, for what purpose, and in service of whom. And for us, at least at Berkeley, we're really trying to do our best to bring all that data together in order to drill down and identify the places where we really need to invest in order to improve the experiences of our students. I can imagine in the different realms and areas you're doing your research, you may have other goals, but I think remembering what you want the data to do, making sure that what comes out of it is actionable, but of course actionable in as correct a way as you can, because no data collection is perfect. And so with that, I will say thank you. It's been a privilege to have the opportunity to speak to you today. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to reach out to me at lgarciab@berkeley.edu. I hope you enjoy your summer. And thanks to the organizers, and particularly Nanette Coleman, for bringing me into this conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for joining us, Vice Provost. I feel deeply appreciative of the fact that you made time for us and you're sharing your brilliance and your scholarship with us. I know our participants are also looking forward to live Q&A with you during the Institute in June. Thank you so much. Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.